I think disappointment maybe doesn't even begin to cover it, Paul. I'm here with Fade, and I know emotions are running high, so I am going to give you the microphone. This is your platform. You guys had an amazing run, and I know this wasn't where you were hoping to end up on, but this is your time. That's your camera.
Yeah, that's all I want to say is like thanks fans support us, and it's like our tournament is end, but maybe life goes on, so it's fine. So we will be back next year. Maybe we'll be strong.
I'm going to let you get back to your team to work through all those emotions. Thank you so much for standing here with me, and we're going to go back to the panel.
Yeah, it's tough.
So TI happened last week. It's why there wasn't a video. Sorry about that. For anyone who doesn't know, TI is the year's biggest Dota 2 tournament where 18 teams from across the world come to compete for a huge prize pool, and my team, Evil Geniuses, lost. But EG weren't the only team that lost. Out of the 18 teams that were invited, 17 didn't win, including 2 heartbreaking losses for the Chinese teams in front of their home crowd, which left the audience stunned. All of these teams devoted years of their lives preparing for this moment, thinking about it, hoping they'll be able to win and achieve their dream. For them, this loss is a genuine tragedy. But that's how it is on this bitch of an earth. There can only be one winner or one winning team. So in almost any competitive event, the vast majority of competitors and fans will end up experiencing a tragic loss. And this extends far beyond competitive events. Tragedy is an integral and common part of the human experience. It's something we all can relate to and understand instinctively, because we've all been there to some degree, even if all you've experienced are minor tragedies like having the girl you like reject you at high school. Sometimes to the person who's being rejected, that tragedy can feel world-ending. Because of how important and integral tragedy is to the human experience, it's almost impossible to leave it out of the story unless you're writing for children. But for the same reason, if you don't incorporate tragedy well, it's immediately apparent to just about everyone who's experiencing the work. That's why getting tragedy right is so incredibly important. Another reason nearly every story has its protagonist experience tragedy in some form, other than it being realistic and humanizing, is because tragedy tests you. The way a character, the way a person reacts to a tragic event defines him much more than the event itself. Tragedy can drive people down very dark paths. Anakin Skywalker saw a vision of a future, and in that future he saw a tragedy, the death of his wife. The fear of that tragedy led him to become Darth Vader, but tragedy can also lead you down a righteous path. Peter Parker's tragic loss of Uncle Ben is a defining moment of that character, and it's what made him Spider-Man. And when a character doesn't experience tragedy at all, or is completely immune to its effects, they become barely recognizable as a human. In his book, The Stranger, or The Outsider, however you prefer, philosopher Albert Camus tried to counter the idea that a person can be completely detached from others and make utterly egotistical decisions. The way he chose to open the book is thus: Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. The way he chose to start the book and cement the image of his protagonist, Marcel, in the reader's mind as an incredibly inhuman and unrelatable character is to show how completely unaffected he is by the tragedy of losing his mother, to the point where he doesn't care if it happened today or yesterday. And later in the book, he drinks and smokes in front of her coffin. He even hooks up with a girl the day after her funeral. This in turn makes the reader completely detach himself from the protagonist, as none of them can imagine themselves feeling absolutely nothing at the passing of their mother. However, when tragedy is depicted well, the exact opposite happens, and the audience will be incredibly sympathetic to the character experiencing it. Now, why is sympathy the opposite of detachment? Let me explain. So first, empathy is different from sympathy. Empathy is when you can relate or understand something, either on an emotional or a logical level. Sympathy is when you feel what someone else is feeling. So, for instance, yawning is a sympathetic response. When you see someone else yawning and that makes you in turn yawn yourself, you're being sympathetic. You're not standing there and thinking, oh yes, I can understand why he's yawning, he's tired. You're actually becoming more tired yourself and you're yawning in unison. You're experiencing the same thing. Your emotions are in sync. Let me use an example to demonstrate. Now, this is going to be a very, very minor spoiler for the second season of My Hero Academia, but it's still a spoiler, so, here's your warning. So, after Uraraka loses to Bakugo, there's a very emotional scene between her and her parents when they're both processing her tragedy together. The scene makes you sympathize with Uraraka, not empathize. At that moment, you don't just understand how she's feeling, you're feeling it with her. In that moment, you and Uraraka are feeling the same thing. Seeing Uraraka cry and talk about her failure will actually make you, assuming you're sympathetic enough, drag emotions and memories of your own past failures, and at that moment you'll feel her failure deeply, as if it was your own, as if it was real. So you see, I am not a pussy for crying during a show meant for children. I am just a very sympathetic guy. Anyway, that's the power of tragedy. It easily accomplishes one of the hardest things to do in non-interactive media. It puts you in complete and total sync with the character on screen. So hopefully now that I explained why it's so important to get tragedy right, I'd like to finish this video by talking about some of the ways people often fail to depict tragedy. Specifically, I'd like to speak about the 3 most common mistakes I see in the depiction of tragedy in modern media. These would be the protagonist not experiencing any tragedy, not processing the tragedy correctly, and overabundance of tragedy. Let's go over them one by one. So, out of these 3, the first is the most common. So common, in fact, it has a name: Mary Sue. Most people will define Mary Sue as a character that's too powerful or too strong. And yeah, that's part of it, but even powerful characters can experience tragedy. A good example of that would be Superman in Injustice. So Superman is an incredibly powerful character. He is nearly a god. But despite of that, he experiences a deep, resounding loss when he's forced to kill his wife and child. Superman is not a Mary Sue. Despite all of his strengths, he's incredibly emotionally vulnerable, and he does have weaknesses. No, a Mary Sue is more than just a character being too strong. It's specifically a character that does not experience tragedy. It's always the first in any competition, it will always win a fight, it's always the smartest, it's always the best at whatever, at anything. It doesn't experience loss, it doesn't experience defeat, it doesn't experience tragedy. If he does, it's going to be a minor loss, a minor tragedy that's going to be reversed in the future, and he's going to deal with it like a champion. It's never going to deeply affect him on an emotional level, because he's just too good for that. He doesn't have any moments where he's self-doubting, because, well, why would he? He never failed. The only thing tragic, usually in a Mary Sue, is their backstory, and that's just to make them look even cooler when people discover they had a shit start. Well, I suppose on a meta level, another tragic thing about a Mary Sue is that this leaves them with the emotional depth of a Teletubby and makes them roughly as interesting as paint drying. Or this video. The second probably requires an explanation. What do I mean when I say tragedy isn't processed well? Okay, So remember the scene I was talking about of Uraraka talking to her parents on the phone after her devastating loss? That's her processing the tragedy. The horrible event already happened in the previous scene. This scene is about her emotionally processing it. By doing so, it gives the previous scene more depth and more staying power, but it also allows her as a character and the audience to move on to the next part of the story without being burdened by the emotions of the previous scene. If you just keep going with the story after a tragedy without ever processing it, without giving it time, the story becomes stilted because the audience never had time to process what just happened. But it's not just about time. You also have to make sure that you're depicting the process well. So, for instance, you can't depict the process of somebody grieving by, say, having him cut carrots. Cutting carrots isn't something most people in the audience will relate to processing grief. Mind you, someone out there might actually have a really great scene of somebody processing their grief by cutting carrots. In a creative medium, there are very few rules, but you get my general point. You know what? Let me give you an example I assume most people will be aware of. The Last Jedi, specifically its ending scene. So, by the end of The Last Jedi, the Resistance has lost. They've lost completely and resoundly. And yes, I'm sure they're going to win in the next movie. I'm not saying they won't. But that's because the script demands it. That has nothing to do with logic or consistency. What happened to the Resistance can't be overstated. It's been reduced to one ship filled with several dozen people. They went from a galaxy-spanning republic to a single ship in a matter of days. But they're optimistic. They're smiling, the music is picking up, the ship is flying towards some unknown destination, and we're told they have everything they need right there. Nobody's mentioning the dead, nobody's mentioning the losses. The sheer optimism right after what was essentially a death blow is bizarre and inhumane. It's like drinking coffee and smoking in front of your mother's coffin. But this time it's not done intentionally to show how alien to a human it is to be completely obsessed about the self. It's done because the writing is shit. The inability of The Last Jedi to acknowledge the tragedy, the inability for the characters in the movie to mourn, to process, to talk about the dead, to genuinely show how tragic the event just happened, and to have that devastate them, as it should devastate them because it was a devastating event, makes the entire scene feel surreal and absurd. And that's a real shame, because some of the most interesting and emotional scenes are people coming to grips with tragedy, with what happened to them or to the people they care about. It's usually more important than the tragedy itself. It's in the scenes following the tragedy where you're getting a lot of character growth, character development, character interaction as they're talking to the people they care about this, and you see bonds forming and you see new sides of people that you already thought you knew. It's these scenes that can tear your heart out or make you view someone in a completely new light. And when you don't do that, either by not having a scene at all, not giving the scene enough time to play out, or just by having a really bad scene, you're robbing the audience and you're robbing yourself as a writer. And that's what I mean when I say tragedy isn't processed well. Now, the third and final problem is the opposite of the first problem. It's when characters are experiencing too much tragedy. More is not always better. That's what she said. No, she didn't. And there is a point where you inflict so much tragedy it ends up looking like a parody. A good example of that would be The Boys, the comic book, not the show. In the comics, Starlight is immediately assaulted by 3 dudes. This then continues for the entire comic, as more and more sexual deviancy happens around her and more sexual assault and harassment is thrown at her. Not only does this take away from the impact of the original moment, it also makes everything feel like a bad joke instead of a series of horrific events. The show handles it much better. They are reducing the number of people assaulting her from 3 to 1. They make sure she's then not completely inundated with sexual harassment and abuse on a near constant basis. She's given time to process her emotions, and she eventually fights back. All of this allows the original moment to have and maintain its impact. Another example is Precious. Now, Precious is a movie based on a book that's based on real life. So most of the events that you see in Precious actually happened. However, the movie itself feels completely unreal. The reason for that is that the movie takes all of the stories in the book that were about multiple different girls, and then it takes all of the tragedy experienced by multiple people and gives it all to one person. Now, despite every single event being real and believable because it happened in real life, and unfortunately real life is a fucked up place, it becomes completely unreal and unbelievable when you thrust it all on one person. It also constantly goes back to a single scene, a single rape scene, and that kind of takes away that scene's impact as well. Generally, the more important a scene or a moment is, the less you want to use it. You want to use it sparingly, preferably just the one time, because the more you use something, well, the less impact it's going to have. Anyway, I hope I explained why tragedy is so important in storytelling. Tragedy is so incredibly common in real life. Everyone has experienced a tragedy, so you can't just not include it. However, because everyone's experienced the tragedy, including it poorly then makes the audience see just how shit of a writer you are. Also, its ability to invoke sympathy and invoke character change, character growth, is just insane. It's an incredibly powerful tool in a writer's kit. So, thanks for watching, and I really do hope you found this video interesting. Because if you didn't, well, that would be a tragedy.